Right, that's good. So I get an idea of my audience. Okay, I'm Andy Beverly. I'm going to do a talk on Rex, which is a deployment and configuration management tool. I'll just run through what I'm going to cover. I'm going to give a quick introduction. Firstly, why I decided to do this talk, and then secondly, what Rex actually is. Just a quick overview. I'm then going to go on and talk about some of its general features. I'm going to talk about why I personally use Rex and why I like it, just to give you an idea of the sort of things that, that you might want to look for. Very briefly touch on how to install it, and then I'll go through and give some general examples, and then finally I'll finish off with some sort of specific examples with how I personally use it. Okay, so why this talk? I've only been using Rex myself for a few weeks, and I've heard lots about all the other main orchestration tools such as Ansible and Puppet and Chef and so on. I only came across, and I've heard lots about those, but I only came across Rex in the last few weeks. So I just thought it'd be useful to give a talk to other people, just to so you know that it's out there and allow you to compare it with other tools that you might already use. And like I said, I'm a recent convert. I've actually moved from Ansible to Rex. For reasons which I won't go into, well, I'll probably touch on them slightly. Like I said, I'm a recent convert, so I just wanted to go out there and spread the good word. So what is Rex? It stands for Remote Execution, and it allows you to very easily run batched commands remotely, normally through an SSH shell. It's similar in concept to Ansible in that you're pushing changes to the server as opposed to having an agent on the server pulling those changes. So the way that it normally works is you have a set of scripts on your local computer or on a computer somewhere, and then that connects to the remote server, runs the commands, and then exits. Every task that you want to do with Rex, or everything that you want to do with Rex starts with a Rexfile. The name comes from Makefile. It's similar in concept to a Makefile, and you just run the Rex command with the name of the particular task that you want to run. And I'll go through and give some examples in a moment. First of all, I'll just touch on some of its general features. Some of these aren't anything special. Some of them are maybe unique to Rex. But the first point there, you've got the ability to group by servers. That's obviously quite useful to be able to group different types of servers together, and I'll go on and give some more specific examples of that shortly. It's very flexible scripting, and as I said there, in fact, the actual scripting that you write is actually Perl. That said, I mean, how many people here are Perl programmers? Okay, quite a few. So if you're at home with Perl, you'll be at home with this. That said, if you don't know much Perl, don't feel that you need to know Perl in order to be able to do this. And in the Rex manuals and so on, it gives you the basic Perl commands that you need to know. Now, the advantage of that is that you can actually stick Perl commands straight into your Rex scripts. Obviously, that makes it very flexible. However, I can easily foresee that being a weakness as well, in that if you're not careful, you're going to end up with Rex scripts that are very complicated Perl scripts. So I think that's just something to bear in mind. I personally quite like that because I know that I'm never going to fall foul of not being able to do something, because I'll always be able to fall back to a bit of raw Perl. But at the same time, like I say, you just need to be careful that you don't create a whole load of unmanageable Rex scripts. So like I say, a strength and a weakness. But as long as you're aware of that, that's the important thing. It's got lots of modules. Modules have been added quite frequently. You can add your own modules. What I would say on that, and I've done both, if you create your own module that is sort of fairly generic, I would push it back to the core branch, and obviously that saves you having to maintain it locally. And I'll talk a bit more about sending in merge requests or pull requests later on in the talk. It's got an Augeas, isn't it? Is that how I wanted to ask somebody this before I started the talk. How do you pronounce Augeas? Is it Augeas? Anybody know? Okay. Close enough. Augeas? I did Google it before I came, actually. It wasn't totally resounding. I'm going to call it Augeas. It's got an Augeas interface. Again, this is not a Rex-specific thing, but it's something that Rex has got a module for, and I'll come on to talk about that in a moment and how I find that really useful. It's got a transactions and rollback feature. I'll give a brief example of that later on. And finally, I've put there, you can store your configuration in a database. Well, actually, Rex hasn't got any sort of all singing, all dancing inbuilt configuration database management system, but what it does allow you to do is to connect into other databases. And again, when I give my examples, I'll talk about how I store my stuff in an external database and then go and get that configuration to do my tasks. So why do I personally use Rex? These are my reasons. Your reasons might be similar or might not. But again, I just wanted to give an idea. It's a community project. It's not a commercial project. It's got no commercial company behind it. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, but obviously that can have its can have its cons as well as its pros. So, I personally find that quite good because you know that everybody is just there to make a better product. It's got some really helpful maintainers and a really helpful mailing list, actually. The mailing list isn't that busy, but I've posted a couple of questions there. I see other people post questions there, and answers come back. In fact, everything gets answered very well, and normally fairly quickly as well. It's got an IRC channel as well. I haven't been on the IRC channel, but it is there, and I believe that that's a fairly friendly place to hang out as well. Pull requests emerge very quickly. Again, I quite like that because if I'm making changes to my local copy, I don't want to be keeping my own local changes. I want to get them back into the core as quickly as possible. And I've done a few pull requests over the last few weeks. Everything has either been merged or had a decent response to within a matter of hours. So that's I really like that. And like I say, just the last couple of points there, just a very active project, which is always a good thing for an open source project. And I've already said it is very flexible. Installation, I'm not going to dwell on this. Suffice to say that there are packages available. They're mainly in third-party repositories, or you can just install it via CPAN. So a straightforward CPAN Rex should get it up and running fairly quickly on your computer. And like I say, it only needs to be installed on the client where you're running it. It doesn't need anything on the remote server. And actually, the advantage of this, because it is Perl, in fact, I don't think certainly in my experience, I've never needed to install anything on the remote server. I know when I've used Ansible in the past, I've had to install Python, because that doesn't normally obviously come on a stock build. So I'll start going through some examples. This is going to be a fairly sort of practical presentation, hopefully, and give some real-life examples. I'm going to start off with a very simple Rexfile. So this is a complete Rexfile that you could run if you wanted to. The first 5 lines there are just setting some parameters. So that would be at the top of your Rexfile. You'd save this into a file called Rexfile with a capital R, and when you run Rex, it looks for a file called Rexfile in your current directory. So that would be saved as Rexfile, and you'd run that from wherever it was saved. First 5 parameters there, like I say, fairly generic. They just specify some configuration parameters. I'm using OpenSSH for the connection. I think that's actually default now, but it wasn't when I first started using Rex. And then just some other stuff about how I'm going to authenticate. I'm going to connect as root and use a key with those private and public keys. So that's setting the parameters, and then the next part on this screen is an example task. So a very simple task, a bit like Hello World, just to give an idea of how you set up tasks. So I just first of all give the task command or the task keyword, which says I'm about to define a task. I give it the name is the next parameter. So there I've just called it the name, say uptime. And then I give it a subroutine of what I'm actually going to do. So in this subroutine, I'm using the run command there is a Rex command. Uptime is the name of the command I'm going to run, and then say is just the Perl command to print the output from that. And I'm going to try and do one live demo, and that's the only live demo I'm going to do, if the internet connection is working, because it keeps dropping off. And it has worked, brilliant. So I've just run, I don't know if can you see that or not? Okay, you can't, never mind. How do I increase this size? Is that any better? It's not particularly good light. Anyway, so all I've done is I've got those lines you saw in the previous slide are in a Rex file. I've saved that Rex file in my current working directory. I've run the Rex command. I've told it what host I'm going to run it on, and then I've said the task that I want to run. So that's just Rex, the host name, and then the task I want to run. I'll go back to the presentation so that you can see that on the following slides. So that's all I do. I run Rex and then the name of the task. Lots of configuration parameters or command line parameters to the Rex program, but the main one I use is the -h, which is just which host you want to run it on. And if you couldn't see that, that just obviously went to the remote server, ran the uptime command, and then printed it to the local screen. I'm going to go through a few more examples, getting slightly more complicated as we go on. This one here is a simple task to update my system. So this time I'm using a Rex module, and there's a Rex module called PKG, which does lots of packaging stuff. And I've defined a task here called upgrade, and that's just running 2 commands from that module, which is update the package database and then upgrade the system. In fact, what I've said there is you can actually create your own. I talked about creating modules earlier. You can create your own modules which are just raw Perl, or you can create your own modules which are actually sets of Rex commands. Obviously, the latter being the ones that you're going to want to manage locally, the former being the ones that you might want to submit back to the core. So what I've done, I've created a bunch of modules, and I'll talk about this later on. I created a bunch of modules that do sort of lots of common stuff, and then it helps to keep my my main Rexfile fairly tidy. So another example, I'm going to go through setting up NTP. So I can start off with a very simple example, which is just using the install command and then the name of the package. So that will just go away and attempt to install NTP. Or I can be slightly more clever and I can say, actually, make sure it's the latest version. So using the pkg command this time, I can say, go away and make sure that the NTP package is the latest. So if it's not there, it will install it. If it's an older version, it will upgrade it. And then the second command there is just say, make sure it's started. So obviously I can, this is idempotent, and I can run this as many times as I want. Obviously the first time it's not there, it'll make sure that it is there, and then the next times it won't actually do anything. The lines in blue there are new, so putting a little bit more into this, I can say, well, actually go away and make sure it's the latest file, then copy in this configuration file from my local computer. There's a file command which does all sorts of stuff, and I'll give a few more examples of the file command shortly. So the file command in this instance, it'll say take the ntp.conf file from my local computer, copy it to the remote computer to that location, and then again ensure that the service is started. Building on that a little bit more, I can say actually when you copy it to the remote server, make sure that it's got the owner and group as stipulated there and the mode that's stipulated there. And then finally, being even more clever, I can say, well actually, I want you to copy it to the remote server. If it didn't exist, put it in there. If it did already exist, then see whether anything's changed. And then I can say, actually, do something if it's changed. So in this one, I can define another separate subroutine and say, if there's any change being made to that file, then restart the NTP service. And actually, I could lose that last line there to start it. So this is that whole thing now will make sure that NTP is installed, make sure it's got the configuration file, but importantly, it will only restart the service if some change has been made to that configuration file. Sorry, one thing I didn't say at the beginning was feel free to jump in with any questions as we go along. I'll give you a few more examples of the file command. I think the file command is probably something I use the most and probably something that a lot of people use the most. It will do all sorts of things from editing files to making sure files are there to deleting files, and I'll go through a few of those examples now. This one here, similar to the last one in terms of making sure that the ownership of that file is what you want it to be. I've got an on-change subroutine in there, but actually the content, rather than defining the content to be a file on my local computer, I've defined the content to be, again, a file on my local computer, but a template. I won't go into the templating language, but suffice to say it's fairly generic type templating where you can put variables in as you copy the file to the local server. And the on-change still works correctly. So obviously if your variables change, then it will trigger that on-change event.
Does it actually have a fixed templating engine in Perl, or can you use whichever one you prefer?
I think you can use whichever one you prefer, but I don't know for sure. I think it is just from the syntax. The syntax is, I mean, when I've used template toolkit, I'm used to square bracket % sign, but I think you've also got the greater than or less than chevrons, haven't you? % sign. I know. I mean, that's what it by default it expects to see it expects to see a less than % variable name and then % greater than. So I mean, that's just what I've been using because that was the default. And I have to be honest, I don't know whether you can change it, but I'd be surprised if you couldn't from the general way that Rex does this stuff.
Well, if nothing else, there's a module called string TT.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Which then gives you a TT command that does template toolkit rendering of anything.
Yeah.
At which point, if you want template toolkit, you can just do that.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So going back to my previous point of being able to stick any Perl command in here, you can see all it's doing is running a command called template to get that content and sticking it into the file etc host. So actually that template command could be anything that returns a string. So it could be, as Matt says, any templating engine, even if it doesn't support it out of the box. A few more examples. You can add a no overwrite parameter if you don't want to overwrite a file even if it hasn't changed. So if it already exists, it will just skip over this command. And just a few other examples. Ensure that it's absent, which is just a way of deleting the file. Correct the file and delete any lines matching something that's I think that's a regular expression. The root there on the second example. Append if no such line exists. So again, I think that's right. It'll look for an exact line and then append that line if it doesn't exist. And the final one, which is actually a patch I submitted, is to search for a regular expression. If that regular expression is found, then update it to the value you've got, and if it doesn't exist, then append it to the end of the file. Okay, so I talked about groups at the beginning. I'm assuming that most automation tools have groups, but I'll just give a brief introduction. I use the group command to create a group. I give it the name of a group. So in the first example, I've created one called web servers, and then in its simplest form, I can just give a bunch of server names that I want to go into that group. Or, as you can see in the second example, I can be slightly cleverer and write it in the format there, so that will generate the same as the previous example. And again, this should look fairly similar to people who use Perl. And then the final example, I'm going to generate a whole bunch of servers there, web 1 to 3, db01 to 02, and just a simple mail server as well. And then to use the groups, I create the tasks as I did before, but I just insert the group parameter. So as you can see there, that's the example from the beginning. I've created a task called uptime, and I've said, actually, this is only going to apply to the web servers group. Okay, I mentioned Augeas. Like I say, it's not something that's specific to Rex, but it is something that I only came across when I started using Rex. It's basically a fairly robust way of making changes to configuration files. It's sort of the opposite around to Rex in terms of it's not actually that flexible, but when it works very well. It does rely on what are called lenses, and you have to have a lens for the particular file that you're editing. There are quite a lot of lenses for most configuration files that you'd normally be editing, but if it doesn't exist, it will just silently fail, which I find slightly unnerving. So you do have to make sure that works correctly. So in this example here, I'm using the postfix main.cf lens, and I'm making sure that the my host name parameter is my host, and I'm making sure that the relay host parameter is that SMTP server there. And that will go in, find those particular configuration values in that configuration file. If they don't exist, it'll add them in. If they do exist, it'll check that they're the values stated. Now, of course, you could do something fairly similar with the file commands as I did before. It's just that this is, I suppose it's probably just a little bit easier, a little bit more robust than trying to grep files and search for regular expressions. So I tend to do this in the first instance, and if I can't do it with this for some reason, then I fall back to the file commands that I showed before. And as with the file commands, I can do an on change. So that will make sure that those values are as it is. If they're not, then it will change them and then carry out that task there. In this case, restart postfix. I mentioned transactions. I have to confess that I haven't actually tried transactions myself, but I thought it was worth mentioning them. Fairly basic and simple, which is just that it runs. You group a bunch of commands in a transaction, which is the second part of that statement. If that dies for any reason, then it will execute the commands in the on rollback part there. So in this example, I've created a temporary directory, uploaded a file to it, tried to extract it, and if for some reason the extraction fails, then it will remove that temporary directory. Okay, so how do I use Rex? The stuff I've talked about there is sort of fairly generic examples. I'm going to talk through how I personally use it, just to give you a flavour of what you can do. So like I said, I store my configuration in a central database. Now the configuration database I used was actually one I had before I started using Rex. I already had a little shell script, or Perl script as it is, but obviously it could be anything that goes away and gets the values from that configuration database. So what I did is I just used that configuration database and script that I already had, and execute that in my Rex scripts, and I'll talk about that in a moment. I use that to get most of my configuration information. In particular, I use it to extract the groups. So in my database, I just say which servers are a member of which groups. And I do that every time I run a Rexfile, and I'll show an example of that. What I also do is I have a set of base tasks which apply to all my servers. And again, I'll show an example of this, but you can call, as you'd expect, you can call different tasks from within other tasks. So I just make sure that those base tasks, such as the generic sort of tightening up SSH and so on, get executed for all my different servers. And then I've got other tasks which I defined, which depend on the server type and the particular group that they're in. And again, I use the like I say, I use the -h parameter to Rex quite a lot. So if I'm setting up a new server, where I know there's been no changes to all my other servers, I can just create a new instance of a server, run the particular type of task or type of server against that, and just specify the host name, and that will go away and run everything, get its configuration information from the database, and set it all up. Okay, so I'll give an example of that. I'll just talk through this. This is another Rexfile, obviously without the headers and stuff that I had on before. The first couple of things I do is include my my local modules. Those are modules I've written. Like I said, I try and keep as much out of the main Rexfile as I can. I've got a bunch of there, but just to give a couple of examples, I've got an SSH one and a web one. The SSH one doing the tightening up of the stuff that I would always do to all my servers, and the web one having a bunch of stuff that I'd set up on a web server. And I then define, again, this is just fairly cut down just to give an example, but I define a base task, which will apply to the base group, but every server is in the base group. And that will clamp down my SSH to do the things that I want to do to lock down my SSH server. And that will happen to all the servers. So I could just run, I could run the base task against my new server, and that would set that up. Or what I actually do is I've got a second task in there called install GADS, which is a piece of software I've got. And I say that applies to the group GADS servers. And the very first thing it does is call the base task. So actually all I do is I run Rex, say I want to run the install GADS task. As long as the particular server that I'm specifying is in that group, the first thing it'll do is run the base task, and then it'll run the other stuff from the web application to set up that server. So obviously the beauty of that is that I've only got to run one particular task against one particular new server, and I know that it'll do everything else. The parameters I've put in there is just to give an example of how you can pass parameters into tasks. So I've passed in two parameters, one called base domain, one called cert domain, and they'll be passed into that task that I've set up. And obviously it will use that information to set it up in a particular way. I talked about how I get a configuration from a database. I'll talk through this now. Like I said, I've got an external script called config.db. It happens to be a Perl script, but it doesn't have to be. And I use that to go and get the information. Like I say, so again, this is a Rex task file, but because it's Perl, I can use any Perl module that's on CPAN. So I'm using the JSON module. So what I'm doing here, and that should be fairly self-explanatory to most people, I'm sure, but I'm running the config database file. This is going away to my configuration database, and it's pulling it a list of all my servers in all the particular groups. I'm capturing that output with the backticks, and then I'm piping it straight into JSON decode. So the output from the configuration database file is JSON, and then it's putting all those server group information into the variable called groups. That in itself is an array reference. So I'm looping through each of the items in that array, obviously dereferencing it first, and then I'm extracting from it. I'm sure most people understand this, but I'm not going to go through it in huge detail. But for each of those groups, I've stipulated what the name of the particular type of group is, and then I've got another array reference in there, which is all the servers in that group. And then the final point, this is the specific Rex bit, so I'm calling the group command, and I'm saying create me a new group called this particular type with all these servers in. So like I say, I run that. I mean, I have to admit that's not particularly scalable, but it works for me. So every time I run a Rex script, it goes away and creates all my groups automatically. And then I might do something like define a task called setup Apache, and with a particular group called the web group, and then I can then run that. Well, in fact, what I can actually do is insert a new server into my configuration database and then run that against the new server. I'm going to go on to talk about a slightly more complicated example. The reason why I'm chuckling to myself is actually when I was writing this talk, I realized that I've broken my rule of not inserting too much complicated Perl into a Rex script. So I think with hindsight, what I will do is put this example into a separate module. But if nothing else, it suffices to show the sort of power that you can do should you need to. And this particular example is extracting certificates, SSL certificates from a database and installing those on the server. So I'm using three main modules to do this. I'm using the file command to copy the certificate to the remote server. I'm using the IPC run3 command to execute a remote command, and you'll see why I'm doing that in a second. And then I'm using the JSON command again because the information is returned in JSON format. So this is it here. I'm doing something fairly similar to the last example. I'm running the configuration database script. This time I'm giving it the parameter of the server name, and in my configuration database I've got what servers have what SSL certificates. So it returns all those certificates again in an array. It returns them in JSON, so I decode that, and then I've got all my certificates for a particular server in an array reference for that server. I then loop through each of those certificates. I've not shown the whole script here just to simplify things. I've just put the one in for the private key because that's the most interesting. But for each of those certificates in that array that it's returned, it tells me what type it is and where it should be. Now, if its type is a key, then it needs to unencrypt it. I don't want to store all my private SSL keys in a central database for obvious reasons. So what I do is I add a passphrase to them every time I put them in there. But obviously when I put them on the server, I'd rather the passphrase wasn't on there, so I can restart the server without any manual input. So what I do is when I run this, again, I've not got it in here, but I get a line of user input when the script's run, and that's to give the opportunity for the user to type in the particular passphrase for that certificate. And then what it does is it creates two variables, one called key and one called out. The key being the encrypted key, which it's got from the database, and then the out being a undefined variable where it's going to put that unencrypted output. And I use the run3 command to pipe that through OpenSSL with the passphrase in the $pass variable, and then I capture the output into the key variable. So at the end of that, in the key variable, I've got the certificate, sorry, the key without a passphrase, and then I use the file command to copy that to the server. Obviously, setting the owner and group as it says there, and as I need it to be set. And then I can also use the on-change event to do something like restart a web server. So you can probably see the advantage of this, which is that when it comes around to my keys or certificates needing changing, then I can run this against all my servers. If it's done it to a server that's had a new key installed, then it'll restart the services required. So all I need to do is actually update that certificate or that key in my configuration database, run this command, and that will go through and update that and install it on all the servers that I've got that on.
I noticed in the context of the example you've got there, you're not actually using the key again after you've run up into the cell. Is that deliberate? Or is it just part of the context?
No, you're right. Yeah, that is deliberate because so it reads the. You're right. I could just put. I suppose I could just put the $cert content straight in there. It was just to sort of simplify it a bit, really. So I'm putting so the key is going into the OpenSSL command. So that's the encrypted key, and then it's coming out in the out variable. Does that answer the question?
Oh, right, okay. Sorry, my mistake. Sorry, I actually did not notice that key was an input because I thought, well, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
so run3 takes commands, stood in, stood out, and presumably stood up.
Yes.
So, and then it's using the file handle from Scalar track.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. That's actually my last example, and that's the end of my presentation. So, obviously, I'm quite happy to talk about any more ways in which I'm using it, or any other general questions. No?
So, general tasks are similar to the way Ansible runs them against all. It defaults to running them against all servers unless you specify a group.
I think I've only ever run them against either a group or against a particular host. So in the most simple example, you won't have any groups defined, in which case it won't actually do anything. So if you haven't got a group defined, you have to specify what host you want to run it against, and you do that on the Rex command line. If you have got a group defined, then it will default to run them to all the servers in that group, if that makes sense. I mean, it's got to get. Yeah. I mean, if you run, I guess what I'm saying is if you do it in its very simplest form, which is define a task without any groups, which is the most simple way of doing it, and then just run Rex, it won't know any host to run it against. Because of course in Ansible, I think you've got the host file, haven't you? Yeah. So it has to get some information somewhere from where to get some servers. That's either by specifying a group to a particular task, in which case it'll run it through all the hosts in that group, or it's specifying something on the command line.
Yeah. However, Ansible supplies a all option that you can give to the hosts list, which, for example, I use it for creating my user account on all machines I'm controlling, and I want that to happen.
Yeah,
so you just do tasks, create the user account,
yeah,
and don't specify groups.
Yeah.
I guess that's why you have basically all of your systems in group base.
Exactly. Well, that's the way I do it. I don't know whether there might be a better way of doing it. That's just the way I've chosen to do it. Yeah, it's a valid point. Yeah, you got to specify them somewhere, and off the top of my head, I think the only way of doing that is either putting them in a group, and that's why I've got my base group, or specifying them on the command line. So, but there might be a better way of doing it. I don't know.
Out of curiosity, what would happen if you tried to run a task that was restricted to a group while still giving the host option on the command line?
I don't know. I'd like to think it won't do anything. I don't, or it might be that that command line. I mean, I've never tried it. It might be that that command line actually overrides that. What I do know is that if you've got, I do know that it works the other way around, which is that if you've got a host in a group and just run it against one particular host, then it will only run it from that one host within that's in that group. But whether it actually ignores, whether it would override that if it wasn't in the group, I don't know. I'd like to think it doesn't, but I've not tested it myself. Cool. Other questions? Feel free to catch me afterwards if you want to ask me anything else.
Thank you very much.